Hello everybody. So I wanted to talk a bit more about the Great Flood and the stories about it. Now, as I said, there's a number of stories around the world about it. Now, if you were talking about, you're doing a proper investigation and you have corroboration from people that couldn't have interacted with each other and they're all saying the same story, then it should mean that it's proven, particularly when you've got scientific facts to back you up and so forth. But some people still believe that the Great Flood was invented. So I thought to look a little bit about it and sort of compare it. So we know that the Christian version, or the Israeli version if you like, is basically the most common and it's the basic one. Now the Muslims, their version is pretty much identical. It's Jewish, really, and there's a few minor changes, but there's not much. And if you look at a story from Wales, and what was it, Dwyn Fan and Dwyn Fach, and it's the story of the Elfunk, and that's, other than having a strange creature that causes the flood, it's pretty much the same story. And of course the story from Ireland it flows on from that, and in fact the whole of the Great Britain, if you like, including Ireland, and it's all telling the similar sort of story. And then you go to the Vikings, or it was actually from Iceland, but same sort of area, and they tell about some frost giants being killed by Odin, and the blood of Ymir, the frost giant, forming the Great Flood. Because that particular frost giant, I think it was, Ymir or Ulgamil, he was quite a special magical creature, so his blood therefore caused the Great Flood, but otherwise pretty much the same thing. And there's a number of stories around the world. There's the Mayans, there's the Sumerians, the Aztecs, and there's the Hopi. And of course by Hopi I'm kind of talking about the Clovis people who were actually in North America before the Mayans and the Aztecs arrived. And the Hopi people talk about entrance to the fourth world, and they talk about most of them surviving, but they had to have the help of the spider grandmother. Now of course that sounds quite different, but it's not that much different. It's still quite consistent with it. Just saying they're going through hollow reeds. Well, reeds can represent boats, and it's still the same story. It's a little bit different, but it's still the same story. The Mayan story says that 7 people survived. Of course one version says that none survived, and that talks about the fourth life, and that sounds quite similar to the story from the Hopi, other than having less people live. And they say that they landed in a new world. It could be the same world. Well, they did share the same world with the Hopi. And of course there's other Native Americans that tell their own story, a little bit different to the Hopi, but it's similar. And I've just used the Hopi as one example. And then the Aztecs say that one story, they say that one man and a dog survived. And then the dog turned out to be a woman, who was a woman at night and a dog during the day. So he could repopulate the earth with his dog, which I think sounds a bit sus, but anyway. I haven't read it properly. But so you're all talking about, that's all the same story. And there's more, there's the Greeks, there's Romans, there's more that I could look up, but you've got a multitude of places that are saying the same story. But then there's others that also talk about the Great Flood in quite a different way. So if you talk about the one from Australia, the big one is of, what's his name, Timberlake? Anyway, the giant frog. I've forgotten his name right now, but anyway, he came to Earth and drank all the water. And I learned this when I was a little child. I was about 7 or 8 when I read the story. Timberlake, I think it is. Yeah, so he drank all the water from the inland sea, and then drank all the water from all the billabongs and everything until he was full. And then he spat it all out again, and then he died. And his death formed Uluru. And of course, if you ask them, they say, well, some geologists will say, oh, Ullaru's been there for over 1 million years and the inland sea evaporated millions of years ago, long time before anyone arrived in Australia, which is, of course, 65,000 years ago. 3 ages, if you like, or 3 cataclysms, that'll work. And so there've been one at 65,000, 42,000 and 12,500. So yeah, so they couldn't have witnessed it. But yet, and they're saying that happened at the Great Flood, which was only 12,500 years ago. They go like, no. They witnessed the Great Flood, but that couldn't have formed Uluru. But then I was looking at people saying that you can't date rocks. You can date the age of rocks, but you can't date how long they've been in a particular location. And there's 2 options. There's one option is that Uluru was under the earth, and they know that it was under the earth at some point, and that it lifted up during the Great Flood. That could easily have happened. Talk about changing sea levels and rocks being moved by cataclysmic events. And the second option is that Uluru actually did come from space, and that it was a meteor. Now you'd say, well, a meteor, if it falls from space, should be broken up and it should just form a crater on Earth, and it should be quite cataclysmic. But this is a solid rock, so it shouldn't be a meteor. So the answer to that is that, and that should be the case with our atmosphere. But if you look at the Great Flood and you look at some of the stories, they're talking about a world that was overpopulated, that had billions and billions of people on it, maybe 30 billion as much, or 15, more than we've got now. And in that scenario, and we know that overpopulation and pollution causes a hole in the atmosphere, and with enough people, it could become so thin that meteors could come to Earth intact. And if that was the case, then it could have come to Earth. Now, it should have done a lot of damage, and well, there you go, we had a lot of damage. And then you say, well, why didn't people in Australia die if that's their story? Well, and we've seen with tsunamis that people sometimes near the tsunami have the water go over them and not actually cause them as much damage as the people further out when it builds up. So people at the impact can still be hurt, but sometimes further away they're hurt more. And that could be what happened, because they've said in the Australian story that not that many people died. And then we've got curiously, and I was looking this up, Japan wasn't destroyed, wasn't sunk into the water. They didn't talk about it. They just said, oh, the Great Flood happened, didn't bother us, so nothing happened to them. And Japan has actually existed for over 1 million years, or has had people in it for over 1 million years. And that's quite different to, for example, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, which are all about 42,000 years old, which is 2 ages, 2 cataclysms, if you like. And so Japan's much older than them. And that's kind of curious because lots of islands in Japan. So you'd think, they'd be at risk, and they're quite low level. They'd be at risk of falling under the sea, but it didn't happen according to their stories. They just didn't have that many people, but they weren't destroyed. And China was another one. China talks about the Great Flood in quite detail, and they say they had the help of dragons, and that they helped to avoid any catastrophic damage. And so far from proving that false, the fact that we've got different stories, and in the case of China, Japan and Australia, without having many people die, and yet still talking about the Great Flood, you've got to say that is stronger evidence than if they were all the same story. If they were all the same story, then you could say, well, maybe people did travel after all and copied it. As we say, they didn't travel, but maybe they did, and they just copy the same story. But they are quite different, and more than just you can't say, oh, that's just their version of it. No, very different stories. So yeah, so that's just wanted to say about that. So that's quite interesting. Okay, bye bye.